Unit testing. Hello everyone, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget, we're going to talk about, well, unit testing, a really important part of any development effort, and it's absolutely true of React.js as well. This is going to allow us to test our code and ensure that it works appropriately at a very basic level before we move it up the chain, commit it to our repository, etc., and other people get their fingers on it and break it for us. As we've been developing our knowledge of React and building out React components, I've made it a point to highlight how moving our user interface code, our HTML, from HTML and into JavaScript introduces a lot of complexity, but it also introduces some flexibility and some power. It allows us to do some things that we otherwise couldn't do. And we've covered a lot of that with properties and state and events, the way that we can make our user interface sort of interactive and more declarative and more functional by moving it into the JavaScript. Well, another great thing, another great feature of moving it into JavaScript is that we can enable unit testing. Our user interface code, our HTML, is now programmatic, which means we can run it through a unit test program, and we can ensure, we can validate as we develop it and make changes to it, that it's running appropriately. And that's what I want to cover here. So the first big challenge that we're going to run into when we want to do unit testing, though, is that we needed an environment to do our testing in. And to date, we've been using JS Fiddle and simply executing our code on the browser, inside of the browser, and seeing the results. And that's fine when we're looking at it. But we want our unit tests to be automated. We want it to be scripted unit tests that run somewhere in the background and execute for us. And if you stop and think about it for a minute, React is running inside of JavaScript. We need to be able to execute JavaScript in order to test this code. And typically, traditionally, JavaScript is executed inside of a browser. So we're back to where we started. We're in the browser again. But thankfully, in recent years, a very popular technology has come up called Node.js. If you're not familiar with Node.js, very simply, it's just a JavaScript execution engine that's divorced from the browser. You can run it right on your desktop. It'll run in Windows, Linux, Mac OS, etc. It probably runs everywhere now. I assume you can run it on a TI calculator if you want. It's very popular. It's very useful. And if you check out this URL that I'm going to flash up on screen here, this is a YouTube video that I put together about how to set up Node.js on your computer, install it, and run a web server from Node.js. We're not going to get that complicated. We just need to make sure that we install it in order to operate as our JavaScript execution engine. Now, along with Node.js, we need a couple of additional libraries in order to execute this. Of course, we're going to need the React library. We have to have React in order to execute React, so Node is going to have a handle, or our unit testing is going to have a handle to the React.js library. We also need access to a library called Babel. Now, without getting into it too much, Babel simply takes ES6 compatible code and translates it into ES5 compatible code. That means it takes the future version of JavaScript, the one that is not supported in every browser yet, it's still being deployed and being developed, and it turns it into backwards compatible ES5 level code that is really widespread compatibility across many different browsers and many different versions. And then lastly, we're going to use something called Jest. Jest is the sort of official testing, unit testing harness for React.js. It's developed and released by the team at Facebook. You can check out the URLs for each of these things right here. Node.js, Jest, and Babel. Of course, getting all these installed and set up could be a bit of a pain in the butt, but thankfully, we have a quick way to do it. We're going to use something called the Node Package Manager, NPM. And NPM is great because we can set up a little file, and we will do this right here, called the package.json file. And that package.json file is going to list all the configuration dependencies that we need in order to run our unit testing. Then we'll simply run a quick command, npm install, and npm will make sure that all of these are downloaded and installed from the World Wide Web. If it sounds complicated, it can be a little bit the first time you do it, but don't worry, I'm going to go through it step by step, show you where the code is, and you can always research and learn more about exactly how all of this stuff works. One of the great things about this, again, that I really like is that the steps are more or less the same regardless of the platform you're running on. So Windows, Mac, and Linux are all going to work exactly the same way, even though I'm going to do this demonstration on Microsoft Windows. So first things first, you're going to want to go to nodejs.org and download and install the Node.js executable. You select downloads here, pick the correct version for your particular operating system. I think most of us are just going to be the 64-bit Windows installer here. And once you've downloaded it, you launch it. It's very, very easy to install. You simply walk through the wizard, agree to the terms. You're probably used to installing lots of different software. Choose where you want to install it. I do want to highlight one thing here, though. This is important. You want to make sure that you have Node Package Manager, NPM, right here, selected to install. It is by default, so you shouldn't have to change anything, but as long as that's white, that indicates that it's going to install. That's very important because that's what we're going to use to install everything else that we need. Click Next, click Install, let this run through the install process, and then I'll have Node installed on my machine. An easy way to verify that Node has installed properly is to simply launch a console window and run node-v, and you should just get a version returned. If you get that, in my case 4.2.4, that happens to be the version that I just downloaded and installed, then you know Node is installed properly, and you can continue with the next steps here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up that package.json file that I talked about, and that's got to include all of my dependencies, everything that I need to run and execute. And what I'm going to do for that, I'm going to launch my text editor here, is I'm actually going to grab it out of the Jest tutorial for React. You can see here at this URL that's on screen. If you scroll down to the middle, it's got a setup, and it says since we're going to use JSX, we need some one-time setup here. This code here, I'm going to cut and paste right into my package.json file. This includes everything that I need. Notice a dependency on React, a dependency on Babel and Jest, and also the React add-ons, the test utilities. Plus, it sets up some default settings for our testing harness down here on the bottom. So if you want to check out this Facebook page, you can read all about these different settings and what exactly they accomplish. We're just going to paste them in and get things done here. I'm going to make sure to strip off this little comment at the top here that's not valid.json text. Then I'm going to go ahead and save this inside a folder I created on my root drive called Unit Testing React. You can call the folder whatever you want. It doesn't really matter what it's named, but this is where I've saved it. This will just keep everything separate from everything else. I'm going to name this package.json. That's very, very important for NPM to recognize it. So now it's saved and now it's there, but I want Node Package Manager, NPM, to actually install all of these dependencies, Babel, Jest, and React. So I need to launch NPM from the command line, but you know what? I'm just noticing that this code is missing an open and closing curly brace at the top and bottom of this here. That's not going to work if I don't include those, so I'll go ahead and resave that as package.json. It's got to be a full, complete JSON object, so you got to make sure you get your syntax right there. So anyways, NPM is a command line utility, so I'm going to drop back to the command line, and I'm going to cd into unit testing React. That's my folder, and I can simply run npm install. Npm install is going to look for the package.json file. Let's do a dir. Yep, it's in there. npm install is going to look for that file, and it's going to install any of the dependencies that are listed in the package.json file. It can take a few minutes because it's got to download everything from the internet where it needs to find it. So I'm going to sign off here, and I'll be back in just a second when this is complete. And when it's complete, your screen should look something like this. I can scroll up and see that there aren't any errors. Everything installed appropriately. And if I run a dir, notice that there is now a node_modules folder. I can actually go in and look at that. And I can see that the various libraries that I'm dependent upon have been installed inside of there. Perfect. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to create my React.js code. So I'm going to start a new file, and I'm going to paste in my filtered list, my cool composite filtered list component that I made in an earlier nugget. If you aren't familiar with this code, I encourage you to check out the React nugget on compound components. But here it is. This is just called filtered list, and if you don't know what it does, well, very simply, it displays a list, a UL, of items with a search box at the top, and as you type things into the search box, it filters down the list below to only show things that match that search. For my local development environment, though, I got to do a couple of different things. For starters, I'm not going to render this at the end with a React DOM.render. This is just my component inside of JavaScript. I'm actually going to do a modules.export. Filtered list. So my filtered list class is getting exported from this file. And I need to do another additional thing up at the top here, and that is I need to require the React library in order for this to work. So I'm going to say import React from React. So now the React.create class library will be recognized because I'm importing it into this file. We need to save this file. This is really important what I name it when it comes to setting up our unit test. I want to pay attention. So I'm actually going to make sure to name it the same as my class. That's kind of a good standard practice, actually. It's going to be filtered list.js inside the same folder as my package. So now I've got my React code that I want to test. The last thing I need to do is I need to actually set up my test code. And this is the most complicated part. Here's where we use our jest features. Going to start up a new file here, and I'm going to paste in my initial code. What I've got here are a couple of import statements: React, the React DOM library, and something called the test utilities from the React add-ons. Those are all libraries that I installed with my package.json. Here's where I'm importing them and actually using them. I'm also telling Jest not to mock up my filtered list control, so Jest can auto mock up our JavaScript. I don't want it to do that. And I've got a filtered list constant down here that is pulling from /filtered list. That's why that file name was really important. This name right here has to match that file name up there, filtered list. Now there's another big change that I'm going to make here from when we were running this inside of our browser, inside of JS Fiddle, and that is my items. I'm actually going to pull out of here. So recall in my React DOM.render, I rendered this with these items. But I've taken React DOM.render out, and if you think about it, that makes sense. This component should be able to handle any array of items that gets passed into it. So the items should not be coming from inside the component itself. I'm going to delete those right out and resave this without the var my items in there. Those should be coming from whatever is rendering this particular component. And in this case, my unit testing code is going to render it. So I'm going to put my items right here in the root of my unit testing script. Now I'm going to start to build out some React code. And again, this is taken right from that React documentation sample. The first thing we want to do is set up our unit test. So I'm going to use the describe and it function to set up my unit test. We can say describe filtered list, and it includes widget as the first item. That's actually what I want to test here. So I want to make sure that when it is rendered, widget is the first item. Now what's cool about this is if I change this up here to put different inputs in, then I could change my test down here. So this test matches the inputs that's set up inside of the test itself. That way I know that when it's getting a different array from a different source, it's going to work appropriately, if that makes a little bit of sense. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually render our filtered list. And I'm going to do that with this little snippet of code right here. I'm going to call testutils.render into document, and then I get to pass some JSX right into it. So this is why I had to install Babel, because I've got JSX now inside of my code. This looks like the React DOM.render code. If you take a look at this here, filtered list, initial items equals my items. So again, I'm tying in this my items, this sample list of items, into my unit testing harness here, instead of into the actual component itself. Well, now I've got a virtual document, a virtual React document with this item rendered into it. And I want to test to see if, in fact, the first item in that list is widget. That's what it should be based on what I've done here. That's what I would expect. So I need to do a couple of different things here. First, I'm going to use a function called scry rendered DOM components with tag. Yes, it's a very long function name here. And I'm going to pass in this list object that I created with my render into document. So render into document returned for me an item called list. That represents my overall React component. Then I'm calling testutils.scry rendered DOM components with tag. I'm passing in my list component, and I'm passing in a tag li. What's that going to do? Well, it's going to get me a cool array back into items here of all of the components that meet that particular search. So all of the li components. Now, great, perfect. I've got an items array with all of my li items in it. I just need to search that and see if the first one is equal to widget. Well, using the unit testing language of Jest, I can paste in this little line of code here, which is expect item 0, that's the first item in the array, dot text content to equal widget. So there is my first unit test for this component. And that's all I need to do in order for Jest to appropriately run this through its unit testing harness. So you might be thinking, well, why use this expect? You could do an if statement on item 0. Yeah, you certainly could, but by using expect in text content and to equal, you'll see the output when we run the unit test in a second is nice and formatted and helpful for us. So I'm going to go ahead and save this document. But it's going to get its own folder. I'm going to create a new folder inside of my root folder, unit testing React, and it's going to be __ tests, plural, __. So I need that folder there inside of my root folder, and I'm going to save this as, well, filtered list-test.js. Another really great, handy, and important standard to stick to is I've named it after the file that it's testing. So it's testing my filtered list. I've just added .-jest onto the end of it. I'll click save. Now I've got my filtered test or filtered list-test.js. What do you say we give it a whirl? Let's see if it actually works. So I'll drop back down to the command line, and I'm just going to run npm space test. And this is one of the nice things about all the setup work, the package.json and the npm install and all these things that we've done. By simply doing all that work ahead of time, I can run npm test and execute my unit tests based on the fact that they are inside of that __ tests folder. And here you can see one test passed. It ran in 1.483 seconds. The total time was 2.5 seconds. Awesome, my test passed. It worked the way I expected it to. Now, to verify that's actually doing something, let's go ahead and let's change our test a little bit. I'm going to come here, I'm going to say instead of being equal to widget, it should equal sprocket, which of course is wrong, but say I had written my test that way. I'll save it and drop back down here, and I will run my test again, and you can see it's going to go through the exact same process. It's that this time it's going to fail, and we'll get some red text indicating that it failed. It didn't run appropriately. And there's the error message. You can see that it's telling me the filtered list, it includes widget as the first item. That's the text that I typed into my my it statement. So it's good to put nice descriptive text in your it statement. And it expected widget to equal sprocket. So I was looking for sprocket, and instead I got widget. That's a failure. My test failed. So I'm going to go back and fix this before I forget about that, and we can move on and build some additional cool testing things. For instance, I could put this code in, expect the last item to equal case. So using the same general method here, I'm getting the very last item inside of the items array, and I'm saying that that should equal case, because of course if we scroll up a little bit, the first item is widget, the last item is case. I'll go ahead and save this, and I'm drop back down here, run npm test, and we should see it succeed on a single test. Now, one of the things that you want to do when you're developing your unit tests is actually use a little bit better structure than this. I'm actually testing two different things here. I'm testing both the first and the last item. I should either update the description of my test itself. So up here where I said it includes widget, I should say widget is the first item and case is the last item. Or I should actually build a second unit test, which is what I'm going to do right now for the next thing, the next piece that I want to test out. So here is my second test, and you can see what I've called this one is that typing an S should make sprocket the first item. That's what I want to test to see if an S makes sprocket the first item, which is exactly what should happen. I'm just going to scroll up here a little bit, and I can see that, yep, when I type in S, sprocket and spring and hose, housing and case should all be returned, but I would expect sprocket to be the first one because that's the first S item on my list here. So I start off generally the same. You can see that I run my render into document item to render this into the document, but now I call a find rendered DOM component with tag input. So this is going to find the first item that has the tag input. That's going to be my search box, of course. I expect that out of my node. And then what I do is I update the value to be S, and I run this little simulate command here. I'm going to simulate a change on search node. So what that's going to do is that is going to, inside of the virtual DOM, it's going to simulate a change event occurring with the fact that S is now typed into the box. That's going to cause the onChange event to bubble up. And if we recall from our actual component itself, onChange is what triggers our list to filter. So that simulate.change is going to trigger that onChange event. Then what am I going to do? Well, just like I did before, I'm going to scry out all of the filtered items, and I'm going to expect the very first item to equal sprocket. Give this a save, and let's give it a whirl. So I'll drop back down to my command line here, and I will run npm test. And what's cool about this now is it's going to say running one test suite, because it's all inside of a single JS file. It's still only a single test suite, but you can see now that there were two tests passed, because there's two total tests inside of that one single suite. And they both passed. They both worked exactly as expected. So awesome. I simulated the typing of the S into my box, and I validated that the search function worked appropriately. Again, if you want to see this fail, we could just change this a little bit. Let's imagine there was a typo in here. Click save. I'll go ahead and run this. What I should see is that my first test is going to pass, but my second test is going to fail, because obviously that typo version of sprocket that I typed in there is not going to match what's inside of the list now. So again, by including that nice descriptive description on my it statement, it typing in S makes sprocket. Oop, I even have a typo there. It makes Sprocket the first item. I know exactly what test it was that failed and what isn't working appropriately on my component. Now looking back here at our code, we've gone over a lot of different things that I didn't really take much effort to explain, like the difference between find render DOM component and scribe render DOM component. The test utils that are built into React are really pretty powerful, but I recommend that you sort of understand what we did here and how this particular unit test works. And then take a look at the documentation here on this URL I've got on screen. They talk about simulate, how you simulate different clicks or changing a value, and they talk about all these different functions that we've worked at, including render into document, is DOM component, all of these different things that we can run and work with and use to build our testing harness out of. So these really replace traditional DOM transversal sort of things that you might do inside of a different language, say jQuery. Well, you can do it right here with the React.js test utils. You're going to learn a lot from this particular documentation. And that concludes this nugget on unit testing for React.js. So to recap, unit testing is all about testing the basic functionality of your React components before you kind of turn them over to other people and let other people find problems that you probably could have discovered yourself. You set up unit testing in a local development environment. We took a little bit of time to set that up, including installing Node.js in the npm package manager, and then setting up a package.json file, a manifest of the other libraries that we needed, which included Babel, React, and Jest, our unit testing harness. Once we had done that, though, we were able to build a very simple script that rendered our item, our component, to the virtual DOM, and then expected different output based on the input that we put in. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.